So a tort has 4 dimensions, and those 4 dimensions are fault, type of injury, type of damages, and excuses. I don't know if those are really the 4 dimensions, but that's how this this picture sort of lays everything out. And I think it's a good way to lay everything out. So the first thing you have to establish with a tort, and remember, a tort is a civil wrong committed by one person against another person. And remember that legally corporations are persons. So this is a civil wrong committed against one or an individual to another individual rather than against all of society like we think of with a crime. So when we talked about fault, there's a couple different ways to look at fault. The first is intentional, meaning that you harmed another person on purpose, that you chose to do so. The second is negligence, and negligence means that had you taken care, you would not have harmed the other person, but you didn't take care, and so the other person was harmed. And then the third is what's called strict liability, and strict liability is where there are certain statutes that sort of spell out liability in certain circumstances, usually in risky or other sorts of circumstances where somebody may be at fault, even if they were not even negligent and certainly weren't intentionally harming someone else. An example of this might be with pollution. If let's say you were storing pollution, some waste or something on your property, and you were doing so according to all the rules you were supposed to follow, and that waste leaks out even though you were doing the things you were supposed to do, and damages someone else's property, you might still be liable under a strict liability tort simply because dealing with hazardous waste is by its nature risky, and doing so in and of itself constitutes a situation that will create liability for you. Anyway, so that's once you've established fault. The second thing you have to look at is the type of injury. And typically there's injury to a person or injury to property. Those are the 2 types of injuries we think of. I won't read all those to you. You can see all the different types of injury to a person. If you want a more full discussion of those, you can watch the entire long lecture. And the same to property. Those are all listed there for you. So if you've established fault and the type of injury, then you go to the type of damage. The most common is that the courts will award what's called a compensatory damage, which is meant to compensate the party that was harmed for their harm. That can include things like the cost of the actual damage or the expenses, any lost wages if you, say, were injured and had to miss work for a certain amount of time, and even for pain and suffering, although that's harder to calculate because how do you decide what someone's pain and suffering is worth? Punitive damages, on the other hand, are just what their name implies. They're intended to punish the person who is at fault. And so they're damages awarded by the court. If you think about something like a doctor who commits malpractice, there might be compensatory damages for the person who was injured to pay their medical bills and then lost wages while they were recovering. But then punitive damages to sort of send a message to that doctor and to doctors as a whole that failing to do their job fully or completely, and that failure leading to the harm of somebody just won't be tolerated, and that they'll have to be more careful. And then the fourth, which I don't know if I consider it a dimension of all of this, but the way they have it laid out here are excuses, or what I would call defenses to tort cases. So if somebody brings a tort against you, you can use some of these excuses. One might be the negligence of the plaintiff, meaning, for example, that if somebody had been harmed while they were on your property, and you could show that they were acting in a careless or negligent manner, and that it wasn't really your fault, that it wasn't the fact that they were on your property, they would have been hurt anywhere if they've been acting in that negligent manner. And then the second is what's called the assumption of risk. This would be why you would sign these assumption of risk waivers whenever you participate in something dangerous. That is, somebody is trying to protect themselves by having you acknowledge up front that what you're about to participate in could be dangerous. And so those are the two defenses, either that the plaintiff was negligent or that the plaintiff knew what they were doing was risky when they did it. Either one of those could be a successful defense. I hope this was useful, and I hope it explained some of the concepts here. Again, there's more on the full lecture if you want to check it out.